it says it's recording, but it didn't mention it. Okay, I think it's on. I'll just go to the. See the screen there, but
see if I can just move it left or right. Yeah, that's okay.
Can you manage?
Yeah, I can do it.
Okay. Right. To our speaker, Dr. David Curran.
Well, thank you ever so much for the invite and also the work that is ongoing at.
Screen. Can you see?
Yeah, I can just move on from there. Yeah, thanks so much. And also, yeah, as an academic, we can kind of go down rabbit holes quite a lot. But it's great to be able to work with UNA associations and branches in the UNA as well, because it's great to see people committed to the United Nations and the values of the organization. Really excited, interested in investigating it and sharing experiences. So I'm really excited to be here. And thank you for the invite, Suhail. It was lovely to receive, and thanks all for coming inside on what looks like a really lovely day. So hopefully, hopefully I'll make it worth it. So what I'm going to speak about is the United Nations. I see there's a little. I see what you mean now. There's a little signal somewhere in the middle of all of that. Let's see if I can do something about this. Low system resources.
It's in the Zoom.
In the Zoom.
Expand the Zoom.
Oh yeah. Yeah. System resources. It's just a little thing saying.
Okay, maybe the Zoom. Oh,
I think it's a sign that it's just telling us that it's just explaining that there's low system resources affecting the audio quality. Try closing some applications to improve performance.
There's only one application. But there's a little cross if we can get to it.
Oh, I see. Yeah. Oh, there we go. Ah, we are. Found it. There we go. Okay. So, so the talk is going to be looking at UN peacemaking or peacekeeping in the 2020s. Challenges and opportunities. Just a bit about me. Don't worry, the writing's a little bit small, so it's more, it can be used. I can talk it through. There's nothing of much interest. Oh yes, of course. Yeah, forgot about the microphone and the thing. So yeah, I'm an associate professor at Coventry University, and since for the last 15 years or so, I've been researching various parts of UN peacekeeping operations. This started with looking at training and how military personnel train for UN operations. But what I found when looking at that is training is a very good little lens in which to view all of UN policies, because if something is important and the Security Council thinks that something is important in peacekeeping, it's going to find its way down to the people that are doing the activity, the peacekeepers. So when you think about the biggest trends and the shape and where people are being deployed to, it's usually the peacekeepers that have to really deal with it all. So I've looked at training, I've looked at various parts of UN policy making, how the UK has traditionally approached UN peacekeeping, and sort of policy areas such as the protection of civilians in UN peacekeeping. And some of that will come up in the talk today. I've also spent some time over in New York at the headquarters undertaking research, and that's that's really kind of informed my opinion and understanding of how these things operate. The first time I went to New York was at the end of my PhD, and I thought I knew everything there was to know about UN peacekeeping. And then I spent some time in and around the United Nations, and I realized I didn't know much at all. As somebody who's now a friend said to me, said, you should never see how the sausage is made. And that was a very good analogy for how things operate in New York. What we'll look at is, we're going to just give a little overview of how peacekeeping policy is formed, and that's going to become relevant when we get to the sort of end. Then the sort of key trends and what's been happening, because I think to look at now, we sort of need to look a little bit backwards and in order to look a little bit forwards. So we'll look a little bit of what have been the key sort of trends, what have been the big things that the UN has done in peacekeeping in the past sort of 10 years. And then sort of speak about why, you know, where we're at. And I think this week you've most probably seen the UN in the news, you know, people standing at the lectern telling the world why the world has got problems. And that does indicate some sort of challenges to the UN that go above and beyond Donald Trump, but he certainly is bringing it home. Just to start, this is a very quick slide. What is UN peacekeeping? This is what I'm looking at. So UN peacekeeping, and you'll see some pictures as this presentation goes on, is the deployment of military, police and civilian personnel under the UN flag into situations generally of violent conflict. So if you think of South Sudan, if you think of Central African Republic, think of Lebanon, you think of Cyprus back in the 60s and 70s, lots of these places were places of violent conflict where a peace agreement was signed between groups, parties, governments, and the UN was brought in to maybe mediate it, maybe oversee a ceasefire, disarm militant groups. The UN Security Council creates the resolutions for these missions, and member states of the world provide troops. So take Cyprus, for instance. Britain has got troops in Cyprus. Britain did have troops in Mali and South Sudan. Peacekeeping missions, though, rely on three things, and any member state that's signed up to peacekeeping, and all UN member states generally are signed up to UN peacekeeping, they always say that peacekeeping always needs three things. So number one, it needs a consent of the parties to the conflict. Peacekeepers have to be invited, right? So it's not an invasion force. The main bit of consent is from the government or the people that are running the place. So whoever is in charge, the key stakeholders, the key leaders of the countries, they must agree to a UN presence. Second principle is impartiality. The UN peacekeeping force does not take sides. It treats everybody the same. And the third one is that peacekeepers do not use force apart from self-defense or defense of the mandate. We could be here for days talking about what that actually means. But the idea is that peacekeeping operations are meant to be using force in self-defense, but more recently, and we'll speak about that a little bit, the trend has been to align this second part, defense of the mandate. If the peacekeeping mandate asks peacekeepers to do something, and that's been agreed by the Security Council, and there are groups that are not allowing those peacekeepers to do those things, and peacekeepers are entitled, should they wish, should it be the right thing to do at the right time, to use force in a range of ways. That number should actually be 60,000 soldiers. There's over 60,000 soldiers around the globe, and they're from national militaries. So, as you know, so anybody that joins the UK Army, and likewise, they tend to join the UK Army. They tend not to think of becoming a UN peacekeeper as their day job. So that's why training is also very interesting, but I won't go down that avenue. Oh, there we go. So to look at developing peacekeeping policy, and I'll just keep this quickly. So who defines peacekeeping policy? So this is when I speak about the sausage being made, and this does become quite important when looking at what's going on in the world. So as you can see, that's a picture of the UN Security Council, and you're all people that know the UN, so this is most probably quite straight down the line for a lot of you. But within the UN Security Council, within UN peacekeeping, there's actually a lot of people that make a peacekeeping operation happen at a kind of conceptual level, at the sort of, the idea of what peacekeeping is, what's important, where should it go, who should it be working with, all of these things is defined by more than just the Security Council. So what you may have is you've got the Security Council. So I've just realized that doesn't look so hot. You've got the permanent 5, so your permanent 5 members. But within that, and this is where Donald Trump is sort of, making things a little bit awkward, you traditionally had a permanent 5 split between UK, France, and the US, and the 2 of China and Russia. So if you look at a lot of the peacekeeping world, a lot of the mandates, a lot of the work that's done on peacekeeping is often kept within Britain, France, and the US, with China and Russia sort of having a different view on what peacekeeping should be. And that's reflected in the policy making. You've got the General Assembly of the UN. So the General Assembly is, every member state, the kind of parliament of the world, and they focus on peacekeeping in a couple of committees. The 4th committee of the General Assembly, they have a month, I think November time, when they all have, they move from the question of space-based technology and they go into peacekeeping, and then they go somewhere else. So that's sort of the way the UN works. So they have a month in November where they speak about peacekeeping, and they all kind of reaffirm their commitment to it. And then in March, they have something called the C34. And this, I won't go too boring about the C34, but the C34 is the Special Committee on Peacekeeping Operations. So for 1 month a year, peacekeeping is totally focused on, and a report is meant to be produced at the end of it. And it's a kind of thematic report saying, we think peacekeeping is important. These are the main policy areas. The reason it's called the C34 is that when it was established, there were only 34 states involved in UN peacekeeping. Now there's about 150. Every member state of the UN has got a say in UN peacekeeping. You go to the C34, like even the Vatican is getting up and speaking about what they think about peacekeeping. It's a very popular activity in the UN. But then you've got the Secretariat, the civil service. So the UN has got its own civil service, and the Department of Peace Operations exists in the UN, and they're the ones that act a bit like a think tank within the organization. They've got to create, the Security Council might put a mandate out saying, okay, we're going to Lebanon, and this is what the mission in Lebanon is going to do. They hand it to the Secretariat, and the Secretariat are like, okay, let's do this. But the Secretariat might also have some other policy areas like protection of civilians or training, where they've got to think, how do we train troops? So it's a really hard-working little civil service bubble within New York. And then you've got the Department of Peace Operations. And then let's just see. Are we moving forwards? We're moving forwards. Maybe we will move forwards. Or backwards. Well, I'll carry on, and then if it comes, it comes. And then beyond the Secretariat, helping the Secretariat are the think tanks. So you've got little groups around, a bit like in London, if you've got things like Chatham House or RUSI or the think tanks around there. Same thing happens in New York, and they help develop peacekeeping policy as well. So you might find, if you go, Google like the International Peace Institute, the IPI, they live over the road from the UN. They do a lot of work with the United Nations. So I'll just see if I can, let's just see if I can. It's okay. There we go. And then national governments, before I try and move on from this very long slide. The UK peacekeeping policy is made in a joint between sometimes the Ministry of Defence, sometimes the Foreign Office, sometimes the Cabinet Office. And so national governments tell what the missions in New York do in the Security Council. So whatever happens on the Security Council is often defined in London, in Washington, in Beijing. So you've also got that kind of feed for policy making. And again, if when you look at, just as a little aside, when you look at, say, what Donald Trump said, you need to almost ask the question, well, who's he speaking to here? Is he speaking to his people in Washington? Is he speaking to the people in the hall in front of him? Is he speaking to his mission in New York? You know, that kind of angle. And that's why policy making in the UN is quite interesting. So with all of that in mind, that's quite complex already. It boggles my mind sometimes because you don't quite know what's going on. You've got the kind of processes. You know, what is it that changes things? Does peacekeeping just happen? You know, what is it that makes it change? And here there's like a very short list that helps me. First, you've got like long-term policy developments, right? So you've got how, you know, if the UN mission in Cyprus was deployed in the mid-1960s, and it might have some lessons from Cyprus that are relevant to other missions. You know, how do we, you know, patrol the ceasefire line, you know, for instance. And you'll get these sort of best practices, lessons learned, long-term development. What does consent mean? How do we understand consent? All of these. So these sort of things are like slow bubbling things that happen. Then you've got member states that come to the UN, or groups of member states that come to the UN with a good idea and money, basically, to implement it. So in the early to mid 2000s, you had Australia and Uruguay were very big on civilian protection. And they mobilized other states. They set up like meetings, they commissioned reports. In what you also may find is that if a state, a non-permanent state on the Security Council, so one of the elected members, is elected onto the Security Council, they'll have an idea that they want to run with, right? So Ireland, a couple of years ago, got elected onto the Security Council, and they passed a resolution on the use of explosives in built-up areas, right? So their big drive was like, the UN hasn't really got much to say about this. You know, this is a key area of civilian protection. You know, we've got war in Ukraine. How do we understand, how do we get things moving on, you know, protecting people from explosives in built-up places? And you have that in peacekeeping as well. Then you've got kind of operational demands from the missions, this sort of bottom-up feed. So a mission in country X has a massive problem. Let's say counter-terrorism in the last 10, 15 years. So like, you know, you have quite large terrorist movements going across West Africa. Suddenly missions are saying, well, wait a minute, we're dealing now with sort of terrorists. We're having to think about counter-terrorism. How does that fit with peacekeeping? And then bump, it goes up to the UN, they have a conversation about it, and they start getting counter-terrorism strategies for peacekeeping. And then the final area is shocks. And this is things, and you could even argue that what's happening now is a political shock in the UN, but you also get operational shocks. So the biggest, sort of most notable one is sexual exploitation and abuse by UN peacekeepers. Now, when I say shocks, it gives the element of surprise. Quote, things like sexual exploitation and abuse could have been prevented from day one. It shouldn't have been a shock. The only reason it was a shock to the UN is that it got leaked. That was a shock, effectively. But what it did, once sexual exploitation and abuse became, you know, quite rightly public knowledge, the extent to which it was going on, the speed of reaction and policy change in the UN under Kofi Annan was fast moving and very deep cutting. Some would say, I suggest it's still not deep cutting enough, but it created quite a radical policy shift in a number of ways. So these things that actually just happen very quickly create a sense of urgency in the UN. And as I said, I think what's happening in the past year with the sort of reform, the cuts to the UN is another shock. But again, not necessarily a shock because people could see it coming from quite a while off, you know, pretty much since Donald Trump said he's going to run for president again. So with all of that in mind, are we all good at the minute? Is this, okay, good. We're going to move on to peacekeeping operations a little bit more now. And this is a kind of, what I would say, like the past 10 years, it's gone from expansion to contraction. And this isn't totally unexpected in the ebb and flow of UN peacekeeping. So some of you might remember like peacekeeping in the 1990s, where like UK had soldiers in Bosnia, and that was a big boom time for UN peacekeeping. But then at the end of the 90s, we had the failure in Rwanda, the failures of UN peacekeeping in Bosnia, the failure of Somalia, and then peacekeeping shrunk. And then at the beginning of the 2000s, it just grew again. So you have these sort of moments. This one might be a bit different though, and we'll kind of come to that in a bit, but we'll sort of speak first about the kind of height of expansion. Just realized I'm looking at that one. Hopefully you can see the black text. Sometimes what looks good on the computer screen, so that you realize on a big screen doesn't look so readable. But there's not much to really look at. So if you go back to 2015, the UN was at a point of maybe like expansion in terms of ideas and also in operations. And I've sort of got it in three areas as sort of examples, but you can see it in other areas. So you have the use of force against spoilers. So this is one thing the UN felt very strongly about. This is, this principle of use of force. But from 2013 onwards, certainly in 2015, you had quite an acceptance that the UN was going to really manage conflict and go beyond resolving conflict and actually force people to come to the table. So in the Democratic Republic of the Congo is an example of this. So the mission in the DRC, called MONUSCO, had what was called a Force Intervention Brigade. And the Force Intervention Brigade had a mandate, a resolution from the Security Council, and it said it will neutralize, and the word neutralize was used, an armed group in the DRC. And those that observed peacekeeping was like, okay, we know that peacekeepers can use force, but if a mandate by the Security Council said, you are there, you'll identify an armed group, which is the M23, and you will neutralize them, that kind of creates a bit of a different world in which you're operating in. So what we found was that missions in the DRC were getting much more robust and combat capable. The Force Intervention Brigade, had, heavy weaponry. It used, attack helicopters. It was effectively a military fighting force. At the same time, you had a mission in Mali, MINUSMA, which again, when I spoke about counterterrorism, it was aligned with quite a robust French-led operation in the north of Mali that was, kind of taking the fight to terrorist organizations. And the UN mission was seen as a partner to that French force. So you had quite a lot of kind of pretty robust action by the UN, backed by a sort of Security Council that felt the UN can do this. This wasn't just like rogue mission. This is the UN as a whole saying this was quite important. The second area, and sort of linked, but not totally linked, is protection of civilians. And this is maybe one of the largest kind of evolutions in UN peacekeeping that there has been in the past 20, 25 years. If you go back to Rwanda, one of the sort of massive failings of Rwanda, I mean, there's many failings of that situation. There was a UN mission in Rwanda at the time of the genocide. But the UN mission was there to preserve the peace between the fighting groups, the government and the RPF. The UN did not think it was there to protect the civilians of Rwanda. It sounds very odd. If you read, say, Romeo Dallaire's book, who was the force commander at the time, when he spoke to the UN in New York, they were like, no, if you found evidence that genocide is being planned, you just must tell the government that you found the evidence that genocide is being planned. You've got to keep the peace. You've got to stop the war. You're there to keep the peace. You're not there. And the idea of you're there to protect civilians as a UN mission was just not in the thinking of the UN as an organization, because the UN as an organization was built a little bit differently. So you had, since Rwanda, Kofi Annan came to the Secretary General and said, you know what, that's really bad if we are deployed in areas where civilians are being killed or being targeted. So how do we mandate missions to protect civilians as well as bring peace? And how do we join the two, civilian protection and peace building effectively? So that's where what is called POC comes from. And protection of civilians now is, you speak about Rwanda and it feels like an entirely different, how can the UN not have that kind of understanding of being incapable of stopping a genocide? But that was the world it was there under the UN, and now the sort of civilian protection creates benchmarks on how the UN should protect civilians when there's a peacekeeping mission deployed. So the protection of civilians, and there's a very good example from South Sudan, where very similar conditions to Rwanda. The South Sudan is quite a new country. The government, the president and vice president, fell out in sort of 2013. It led to armed conflict between the two, the group supporting the deputy president and the group supporting the president. Civilians fled to the UN bases, much like what happened 20 years previous with UNAMIR in Rwanda. The UN opened the bases, so they offered protection to the civilians that were seeking shelter. And when I think 2 Indian peacekeepers were killed in this sort of melee, the Security Council did kind of the opposite to what they did in Rwanda. In the case of Rwanda, they downsized the mission. So this isn't our fight. In the case of South Sudan, they reinforced the mission. They added extra troops, and they ran they turned the mission on its head and said, we are a protection of civilians mission there. We're there to protect civilians in South Sudan in 5 large sort of POC camps, as they called it, protection of civilians camps. And this has largely been accepted by the UN. And you could say, like, in sort of, South Sudan is in a much different place now. It's not at the perfect stage in its, in its own political evolution, but then again, where is? But certainly the decisions by the UN to protect civilians quite directly by giving them the space within their own camps was a sign that protection of civilians is a thing that works, and the UN can do it. The final area is what's called stabilization missions. And stabilization missions they may be disappearing off the landscape, but the UN had, say, 3 quite large stabilization missions during this time. One in the Central African Republic, one in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and one in Mali. So these 3 missions, and they were called stabilization. It caused a little bit of problems because the UN had no working definition of stabilization. Right, so the UN would call missions stabilization operations. They'd be there to do stabilization activities, but when you looked at all the documentation, wasn't a great deal of knowledge about what stabilization meant to the UN. It was seen as sort of being largely driven by NATO member states like the UK that had quite a lot of experience in Afghanistan and Iraq. And it was much more about building a strong government, supporting a strong government, and that government will be the main security provider. So it tested some of these questions about impartiality. Because if you're not in the government and you're against the government and you're an armed group and you're kind of been fighting the government, the UN mission arrives and then they're supporting the government. Right, and the government has quite a lot of say in who is good, who is a trusted partner, and who's somebody you might want to knock off effectively. And if places like Mali, that is what the government tried employing the UN to do. So it was a very kind of problematic area, but it was the biggest missions were called stabilization missions. So they were the sort of expansion, but then contraction happens. So we have contraction in 3 areas. Again, my apologies for very dark writing on a dark screen. It gets better. Operational challenges in the protection of civilians was the first sort of area of contraction. So you had, in the case of South Sudan, you had many challenges of keeping these protections of civilians camps operating. And what would happen, certainly in South Sudan, was when the UN had a camp with wire around it and people inside, and maybe some armed groups outside, there were problems when the armed group outside felt that there were people inside the camp that were running outside to fight it and then running back inside to the protection of civilians camp. That was the kind of crux of many of the problems. So there were a few cases in South Sudan in certain POC camps that were at times slightly overrun by government forces, and UN peacekeepers who were there to sort of protect the camps quickly decided they're not really that good at that sort of thing. And national governments, particularly, well, I won't target any particular government because, you know, it's a hard job, but certain national governments kind of implicitly said to their own peacekeepers, do not come back dead. When that happens in protection of civilians work and civilians are targeted and you're the line between the civilians and the attackers, having your message from your national government to not come home dead is sort of like a little bit of a hard one to square. So you had reports written in the UN in 2016, 2017, very critical of particular member states, particular soldiers and units that were not actively trying to protect civilians. They just felt they were happy with the protecting civilians camp. You also had quite a lengthy debate between one part of the UN called the OIOS, the Organized Operation, no, I can't remember what OIOS stands for, and another part of the UN, which is the Department of Peace Operations, and the OIOS said, you're not using any force to protect civilians, you're not shooting people to protect civilians. Department of Peacekeeping Operations said it's not all about shooting people, it's about dialogue. So there was lots of debate in the UN. Second area was making stabilization stick. And these big stabilization missions were quite problematic. You had this idea about the UN joining forces with the government was good in terms of some of the logic of doing missions. But if they were linked to an unpopular government, then that became problematic. So you had in the DRC, you had known human rights abusers working in the security forces in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. In the case of Mali, the Malian government wanted at the time the UN to actually actively be kind of the bulldog, effectively, you know, the bad cop, and sort of get rid of armed groups. And so lots of questions were sort of raised about the UN's ability to really side with governments that aren't really that legitimate in the eyes of the population. And a lot of what the UN does, and the peace building aspects of the UN, is to support the host population. It's not to support the elite governments on their own. In addition, the UN wasn't the only place having problems with stabilization. And if you look at what happened in Afghanistan, and the UN sort of is a sort of bit of yin and yang, the UN kind of, or supporters of the UN looked at what happened in Afghanistan and said, you see, it's not that easy, is it? You've pumped, you know, the US, NATO states pumped millions and millions and billions of dollars into Afghanistan, troops, you know, from countries around most of Western states, the most highly paid troops globally, and Afghanistan still imploded on itself politically very quickly and very catastrophically. So you had this kind of, you know, question about, well, what this nation building stuff, you know, is not that easy. And the UN kind of said, like, yeah, it's not. You know, we've been trying to do this, so, you know, you've got to think about this more. But what it's led to sort of a degree of reflection amongst countries like Britain, amongst countries like France, Australia, what is stabilization? And the sort of final nail in that has been in Mali. So in Mali, the government that the UN sided with got kicked out in a coup. The new government decided that the UN weren't the best partners, and who could be a better partner than the UN? The Wagner Group from Russia. So the coup government in Mali sided and you know, undertook security cooperation with you know, the infamous Wagner Group, which led to the UN mission being pretty much sidelined to start with. And then eventually the Malian government, the coup government, said, we don't want the UN in Mali anymore. They told them to leave. So the mission in Mali left with, like, in a sort of 9-month period. Did the MINUSMA mission leave Mali because it was a stable, political, peaceful environment? No, it left largely because the government said you must go now. So stabilization, that question of stabilization, these large, big, heavy footprint missions have led, in the case of Mali, you know, in the case of Afghanistan, this has all led to questioning about what is it we're doing in these missions. And then budget and momentum challenges. Well, just that comes to this one. So missions have gone. Mali, Haiti, Liberia, Cote d'Ivoire, Darfur. Their missions are all kind of closed down. Some just closed naturally in the 2010s. So like Liberia was a very small mission, but you had the mission in Haiti leaving quite quickly. The mission in Darfur leaving, and again, if you look at the sort of situation in Darfur, it's not necessarily a very peaceful place. A reduction in budget, and that's just been quite substantial. So from 7.87 billion in 2016, and it's now down to 5.4 billion in 25-26. So we're almost getting to, not totally a half cut off the budget, but we're looking at a good, my maths is terrible, maybe a third of the budget that we've seen. And then with regards to peacekeeping numbers, it was in sort of 2016, about 100,000 deployed peacekeepers, and now we're down to 60,000. So there's a real kind of downturn in this enthusiasm for UN peacekeeping. And that has led to, I would say, quite a lot of questioning within the United Nations as to what is going on and what's happening. Now, if I go back to like the 1990s, my kind of belief has always been that it's cycles. The UN does go in cycles, and they're not like perfect. You don't have a cut-off point and a start point and a cut-off point and a start point, but you do have areas of momentum and areas of trends and areas of sort of agreement and consensus. And there is a sort of, the level of sort of, kind of, we haven't had like a catastrophe like we had at the end of the 1990s. The 90s were marked by absolute catastrophe. We've had trouble, and we've had missions ending. And where the catastrophe has happened, arguably in Afghanistan, has been outside of the UN's control. And there's actually still a UN political mission in Afghanistan, UNAMA, that doesn't do anything with soldiers, it just monitors the political situation. So that leads us to think about, okay, well, what do the next 10 years sort of look like if we're to do that? So we've seen a very active UN being, hitting some big challenges. I would say that they're resilient. So these missions, so the first peacekeeping deployment was, you've got UNEF-1 down in 1956, the first armed peacekeeping mission, right? And peacekeeping missions, all this consent, impartiality, non-use of force. I should have said this at the beginning. Peacekeeping is not in the UN Charter, right? So if you go to the UN Charter and you look for the word peacekeeping, it's just not there, right? So this is an idea that's appeared in the United Nations at a time when it was needed. And in 1956, that's what happened. The Secretary General at the time, the permanent representative from Canada, said, like, okay, we need to deploy something in, after the invasion, UK, France, and Israel have invaded the Suez. The US have come to us and said, you've got to do something to get them out. Okay, let's put a UN force there. Okay, what's a UN force? Right, okay, consent, yep, non-use force, good, impartial, great. And then that idea has lasted, so there's a resilience in the idea of peace operations. So the things that have happened around them do happen, and there's trends and there's things that go up and go down, but the idea of deployment of armed personnel to support ceasefires and peace agreements is a resilient idea. And peacekeeping is not the only, but it's one of the few, the UN is not only, but one of the few organizations that does this, and does this with a kind of global consensus. So that would say that there's been two areas where you've seen development. And one has been, and this is sort of development that I think is kind of logical and progressive. One is that you've got regional interventions. UN has spent a lot of time working with the African Union to be a kind of a leader of peace operations on the African continent. And there's been quite a lot of debate at the Security Council level in the UN about how to ensure, it's very kind of boring technocratic language, but how to ensure predictable financing for African Union operations. Now, predictable financing does sound like quite dry, but it's actually the lifeblood of a lot of the AU's work. is if the UN can find funding mechanisms to give the AU the ability to launch and keep and maintain operations, then that's a good thing. That means that the AU and the UN are working in sort of lockstep, as opposed to the UN trying to do something and the AU trying to do something. So you have this kind of language of regional interventions, regions and sub-regions that the UN is using. And that's partly a reflection of what's happened in the past 10 years. Like, okay, if we as an organization cannot manage these massive missions, what role would the African Union play in, if the African Union had an expanded role? And how can we work together and not work against each other? The other area is what they're calling sort of like nuanced deployments, right? So if we look at missions in Colombia, so the UN has a mission in Colombia that's largely a political mission. There's not much of no military footprint really. There might be a few observers, but it's largely political process. It's largely disarmament processes. It's largely police and security sector. So it's not a heavy mission. It's actually quite a lighter mission. The mission in Afghanistan is a political mission. So what you find is that there's a lot of political missions that go on around the world, which don't require like the militaries of the world to deploy, but take a much more sort of softly gentle approach to peace building in countries. There's also been a few reports in the last year, there's very long reports on creating kind of, I suppose modular peacekeeping is the word that's used. Instead of having these massive mandates that says like, in Mali, we're going to do this, all the way at the bottom. Mandates can sort of have like almost like a plug in and play element that you just bring certain parts into the mandate and remove them, and you keep the mission relatively small, focused on certain things, instead of having a massive mission. And the Department of Peacekeeping Operations, and I think I've said it here, it's largely driven by the Secretariat, it's driven by the think tanks. This is a type of reflection that the UN naturally will do at the end of the phase, right? So this is, as I said, the end of the phase. They're thinking about what could be done next to keep the ball rolling, to keep peace processes alive, to keep the UN relevant in that, because the UN has built up so much knowledge of how to do this stuff. I mean, I'm really spoken about that, but all of these things, protection of civilians, use of force, peace building, behind every mission and every peacekeeper deployed in the country, there's a stack of PDFs or documentation that informs it. The UN has got, there was the Secretary General said like, something like there's 10, no, I think more than 10,000, but he said something like there's 10,000 documents on peacekeeping, and do we ever read that? Yes, some people do. Unfortunately, I get paid for it, so I'm not going to complain too much. But there is so much documentation. So the UN is relevant, but it's making sure that relevance is applied in missions. And I think that's a logical debate for an organisation. However, and there is a however, just go over a minute. Yes, however, concerning futures, and I think this is where we see the top down from the member states, and this is maybe brings it to, so when we go, so like going all the way back to that lengthy slide on who makes peacekeeping policy, right? So you've got the Secretariat, you've got the think tanks at the one side reflecting. Now you've got the member states, right? And the member states might have some other ideas on what to do. So, and you'll all be noting this, the reduction of spending on aid and on peace building activities in the West. And the UK is, we are not doing very well on that front. We are moving away quite substantially from some of the things that were part of our sort of DNA up until 2019, 2020. If you look at the latest UK government strategic defence review, multilateralism is not there. It's just not there. The UN is not there. All of the stuff, stabilisation, the UK has been involved in Afghanistan for 15 years plus on a stabilisation mission. The word stabilisation, literally the word stabilisation, doesn't really appear in its latest defence and security plans. All of that is like consigned to the past, and the future is different. Okay, so the future is about threat actors. What will happen with Russia? What will happen with China? What will happen with Iran? We're looking at interstate warfare as a kind of future, security threat. How do we engage with kind of the threat from states? What does that mean for the UK? It's a move away from maybe what was under the last 10, 15 years, like, quote, the rules-based international order that David Cameron spoke about. The US policy towards the UN is to be expected, but still not good. I think looking at what Donald Trump said on Tuesday, I wasn't necessarily surprised about what he said. I mean, in some ways, it could have been a lot worse. It could have absolutely annihilated the organization, pulled the UN out, pulled the US out even more. It was by no means good. He chastised the organization, particularly on migration. He said that the UN wasn't there when it came to peacemaking, and he spoke a lot about bilateralism, like the US will do things with country X, Y, Z. That is a trend, I think, that is happening in the US. Is at the forefront. The US is very much espousing it. Not often you get the US president, the key backer of the multilateral system, the United States, go up and forget to really speak positively about the UN, or maybe not forget, but decide not to speak positively about the UN in one bit. I think it's led to this sort of idea of, like, when I spoke about the P3, the permanent 3 and the permanent 2, where does the US sit in this now? Okay, so it does mean that Britain and France are, it's very, very odd. On the one hand, you've got the British Security and Defence Review, which is like we're looking somewhere else, but also you've got Britain and France and other European member states in the UN working out how best to manage the situation. So, you'll see, I think you are seeing diplomatic maneuvers by a lot of European member states to kind of just roll with what Trump is doing. I think at the beginning of the summer, or no, in February, when that first meeting with Zelensky, where everything went wrong and there was finger pointing and argument, you saw very quick reaction by European member states to kind of almost keep the show on the road. And I think that's what's happening in the UN amongst other member states. I do think, and this is my sort of belief, that Donald Trump sees value in the UN as a meeting place for world leaders like him. And I think that is a little bit of, that plays to the ego of the president, I think, and it plays to the egos of lots of presidents. There's a reason why presidents like to speak to the Security Council and the General Assembly. It plays to their importance, which is why they've been elected. I do think that exists as well with President Trump. I do think he understands some kind of value in the UN being the place where things can get done because he gets to meet other world leaders. But I say that very tenuously. There's not much evidence to that. It's just my sort of slightly optimistic belief. But the other sort of concern is that, when I spoke about the African Union, and when you couple it to some of this sort of disengagement from the West and the move towards bilateralism, academics have spoken about it, and they've called it deinstitutionalization. And that reflects the idea that member states and organizations are seeing the UN as not as effective as doing what it could do in this field, so they'll just do it themselves. We'll go bilateral. Okay, so we will make new agreements. We will agree on things outside the United Nations. And I think that is a concern in the peace and security field. There are new actors undertaking peacekeeping operations, some just through bilateral engagements between 3 or 4 states. They'll just do their thing and seek approval afterwards. So that kind of disengagement leads to a much more complex world in the sort of conflict management space. And the UN is sort of losing some of its control. And I think that could be managed normally, managed in one way. But I think given the pressures from member states, the member states of the world focusing on different problems, that becomes a bit of a concern, I would say, at the institutionalization. And I think finally, yeah, this is my last slide, so then I think I've hit my time. I might have gone over, ever so sorry if I've gone over. As I said, there'll always be a demand for peacekeeping-style intervention. I mean, the UN has been spoken about in Gaza. The UN has been spoken about in Ukraine. So you cannot discount the fact that this activity undertaken by the United Nations will be needed in the future for conflicts that do not, do not look like they're ready. If you go back, UNIFIL in Lebanon is, I mean, that's meant to be leaving next year. That's a fantastic example of the UN being used and the peacekeeping mission being used as, they called it, the off-ramp for the last Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 2006. They invaded south of Lebanon, went all the way through. The invasion didn't really meet any of the sort of key things that the Israeli government wanted. Net result was, part of the agreement was to reinforce the UN mission UNIFIL, to disarm Hezbollah, to keep the ceasefire line. Italian, Spanish troops, Irish troops deployed in that area, more robust. Israeli withdrew back to Israel. Hezbollah, sort of demilitarized slightly. It was an off-ramp. So you see times where it doesn't look like peacekeeping can be the answer. It can be the answer as well. There does need to be political cooperation in the UN for this to happen, though. And I think that's the question. Is there political cooperation? Is the Security Council consensus based on what peacekeeping is and what it should be? As I said, they had the P3 and the P2. So now you could have a P2, and a P1. So you might find that Russia and China might become a little bit more assertive in the Security Council on what they think peacekeeping should look like, because they know that they've got a kind of US is at best ambivalent to the activity. And if it goes wrong, lack of coordination can create stasis. It can create missions that don't quite go anywhere, that don't evolve with conflict trends. It can create unachievable mandates. It can create missions that are not well equipped for deployments, or it can just, leave the UN out of the picture. So there is a danger at that lack of coordination at the Security Council, but for whatever good work goes on around the Secretariat and in the General Assembly and in think tanks, it's always the Security Council that it needs to work and function for peacekeeping to function. And I think that's it. So thank you ever so much for your time and for listening. So cheers.
We'll have some questions. Somebody handling the mic? Yes. And if you won't mind repeating the question.
Hello, can you hear me? Yes. Just an excellent, fascinating. I'm sure some detailed questions follow up. Are you an optimist? Realist or pessimist?
Okay, it's an easy one to start. For people on Zoom, am I an optimist, realist, or pessimist? I think I'm going to say optimist, and I think that I come from a Centre for Conflict Resolution. That's my kind of academic grounding, my background, and that's the Department of Peace Studies at the University of Bradford. And Bradford's tradition has been to effectively to find delight in the lot, without sounding too evangelical. It's to find, there's a very good article by one of the academics about hawks and doves. So even in the most hawkish regime, you'll find the doves that are part of that. You'll find people that are willing to compromise. You'll find people that are willing to find pathways to peace. And I think that even at times where you've got quite a hostile US president to the UN system, you've got member states moving out, there'll still people within these organizations that see the value and the utility of the United Nations as a peacemaking actor. I think the challenge at the minute, and the pragmatist in me at the minute, is that there are people in the UN that most probably find it quite difficult accessing those channels, making those channels work. But I think there are, I think that what this sort of type of intervention provides at a very base level in amongst communities, it provides a space for political contestation to happen without violence. I mean, it's not to stop conflict, it's not to stop everything, it's to stop violence, and it's a mechanism that's quite unique at stopping violence when it's at its most violent. So I do remain optimistic about it. I am aware that this is not a good time though. So, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. The question is, final reflection on Gaza and Ukraine. I'm wondering if you can say a bit more about what role you would like to see the UN playing in those two conflicts. Damaging to the whole of the rest of the world. Yeah. The nations involved. It seems to me the big point got to anticipate those conflicts, trying to build peace before it gets worse.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's a very fair critique. Just for Zoom, I mean, the question was, what can the UN do in Gaza and Ukraine, and also that the UN could have seen a lot of this coming down the line. Now, I suppose I caveat that by saying that there's people maybe in this room and there's people out there in the world that know a lot more about Gaza and Ukraine than I do, partly because there's not a peacekeeping mission in either of these places. But I will say that it highlights a lot of the challenges of the UN system as being an effective manager of global conflicts, right? And I see what you're saying about the preventative and the UN could prevent it. The UN could only prevent things happening so much because the UN is a state-based organization, and it's a reflection of the power of states in the global system. So I would say both cases are a failure of politics, right? So Ukraine is whatever happened in Ukraine, the question that was posed by NATO expansion or EU expansion that may have posed a question of a security threat to the Russian government, but the answer that the Russian government provided was not the right answer, right? That's a failure to me of finding off-ramps, suitable off-ramps before invasion happened in both cases, in 2014 and in 2021. Whether the UN was able to strong-arm the Russian government into not invading Donbass in 2013, whether the UN was able to strong-arm the Israeli government to not react in the way it did to what happened on October the 7th, I'm not too sure it could have, and that's the challenge. The UN was not strong enough to stop the US invasion of Afghanistan. You can go back through history. Pretty much every major country in the world with a large military in the time of the UN that has invaded another country, the UN most probably wouldn't have had the capability to stop that country doing what it did, right? That's a problem of, I would say, the mechanisms. People speak in the UN about the mechanisms of conflict prevention and effective conflict prevention. It is an area that's largely kind of underfunded within the UN. It's an area that people know that these situations are bubbling and rising in the large scale conflicts that we're seeing now, but also in places like in the Central African Republic, where there's a peacekeeping mission. I mean, the UN celebrated itself in the Central African Republic. The French president celebrated, well, we've deployed a force in the Central African Republic. We're going to save the people in the Central African Republic. If you looked at the number of international actors in the CAR at the time when there was a political implosion, you had the US, you had the EU, you had the French, who were a colonial power. So you have got people that can prevent conflict, but sometimes conflict happens for other reasons that are much stronger. sorry, that's my spiel on that. What can the UN do? Now, I know another hand. What can the UN do? I think it's up to the UN has tried quiet diplomacy. I think it has been as effective as it can be in Ukraine. I think it's the fact it's being targeted in Israel by Israeli forces is massively problematic on a number of levels. The fact that the UNIFIL operation in Lebanon was targeted by the IDF, again, was hugely problematic. But certainly in the case of Lebanon, what it said to me was why, you know, they are targeting that UN mission because that UN mission is watching and what they are doing and is holding them to account for what they're doing. That's the reason why the UNIFIL mission was being attacked. And that's a good sign for the UN. And if the UN can maybe keep its role and keep a role in these places, you might see that there's a role for its accountability. It's not a perfect answer, and it's not these are catastrophes that I think are that people within the United Nations are trying to deal with.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. Expanding the UN Security Council, by additional bodies such as India, the African Union, and Brazil, for example.
Thank you. Yeah, I presume the question was about reform of the Security Council and has there been attempts? Yes, it's a very hard process. For obvious reasons, the veto of the Security Council, permanent 5. Countries will come every so often with a good idea, and so that might get agreement from one of the permanent member states. So I know, you know, in the mid-2010s, the French government wanted to restrict the use of the veto, for instance, in case of mass atrocity crime. And the same, so you have these initiatives that come, and one is about expanding the Security Council. They get bogged down, these things, because suddenly you'll have the question like, well, who, right, and why? So who and why? So Brazil might want to do it because we need a Latin American country on the Security Council. India may want it because it's the most populous nation on earth. China, well, not necessarily, but let's say Japan may want it because of the amount of money it puts into the UN and has not got anything to show for it. So you start getting like, and I think this argument is purposely tipped on its head by people that don't want change. Right, because you know you just create a debate about this. Where reform has happened, I mean, I did a bit of work on the reform world quite a while back. There was an attempt, I think, it was called the ACT group, ACT, and it was all like small-scale reform. It was led by the Swiss government. It was about how do we make small-scale reform to the working practices and methods of the Security Council. And their angle was, if we do it on working methods, we do this working method thing, then maybe we can just prize open the process. And that process got far, but then got squashed by the permanent members of the Security Council. They, you know, I think the one thing that is often forgotten, and this is again when I go back to when I went, is that what is often forgotten about the Security Council, it's one of the most politicized environments. You know, it's the UN has got the ethics, which I agree with, which we all agree with about, you know, it's save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, all of the good stuff, you know, the values. But the Security Council itself is where hard politics is played out quite brutally, and because it's the center, it's got the main, you know, it's got nuclear powers on it, it's got people that are trying to get their agenda across, and it's about horse trading. And I think the reform agenda is really difficult because it tries to change that, and it only needs one of the member states just to say, no, we don't want this to happen. May see, you know, if you want to see how it works, and it may work this time, look at the campaign for a female Secretary General. You know, that's an example of what you might see that could get achieved in the next, you know, 2 or 3 years. But you might also see if it doesn't happen and we have another male Secretary General, you'll see a lot of debate about the anachronistic way in which the UN functions in its organization. So that might be something to follow to see how it works.
Okay. There is much we could obviously develop and discuss, but at a practical level, once the determination has been there that there will be force representation in a country, how does that actually come to pass? Who makes the determination as to which countries will form that force?
Yeah.
To what, and basically to what extent does each country make a contribution?
It's a very good question. So, for Zoom, the question was, once a decision has been made to deploy a mission, what's the process in terms of deploying, who gets chosen to deploy? So when a mission is sort of, when a Security Council creates a resolution for a peacekeeping mission to be deployed, that's generally more a rubber stamping exercise than oh my goodness, we've got to make a mission out of this now, right? So what will inform, this is why I say, like, if you take Ukraine, for example, once, after the first invasion in 2014, there was a group of people in the Department of Peace Operations working on what a mission concept would look like for a Ukrainian deployment, okay? There's mostly a stack of missions that have never quite happened, sat in a filing cabinet in New York. So what would happen there is that they create the sort of the maps of each member state have got a military advisor attached to them. So like there'll be military advisors. There's like a military staff committee of the Department of Peacekeeping Operations, or Department of Peace Operations. So the conversations will be had. Again, Department of Peace Operations will go to the missions. The missions will go to national capitals. National capitals will come back. There will be some countries that are much more amenable to deploying soldiers on peacekeeping missions than others. So if you look at the contributors to UN missions, you've got the top 5, I think it's like India, Jordan, Nepal, Bangladesh, Egypt. Largely, and again, totally different conversation for a different time, largely countries from the global south, the developing world, contribute peacekeeping, soldiers to peacekeeping. Countries from like the west or the global north, the European Union, they won't send 5,000 troops to the DRC, no chance, because they don't want to. They cost too much money. They're too important, and we don't like putting our soldiers under the UN flag. I have issues with a lot of that conversation, but we'll save that. So they'll go to maybe countries that they know will have capacity to deploy troops and equipment. So you also have countries, again, if you go to things like the C-34, and this is pre-invasion, but you had like the Ukrainians saying, we provide the helicopters, we provide the strategic airlift, we provide the logistics, that. So countries, they'll know that they've got the capacity to do that. So it's generally up to a point when the Security Council creates a mandate, they'll also have a benchmark, the ceiling of troop numbers. Often missions don't really reach that ceiling. There's usually a gap. But they'll have an idea of like, they call it, this is such UN language, they call it a capability-driven approach. So they don't want like every country saying, we're going to send you so many infantry soldiers, because they'll say, well, we need engineers. And 10,000 infantrymen can do so much, but they can't build a field hospital. So we need field hospitals. So what the UN will say, we need this, and this. And the member states will go to the Secretary General and say, we'll plug into that. That's generally how it works.
Thank you very much. Thanks again. So we'll do a few things. We'll take a group picture with David. Some of us are going to Pastor Chibo afterwards. So if you want to gather around here, 12:15. Otherwise, there's coffee and tea next door. Please help yourself. And once again, thanks for coming. Thank you. So pictures. It's a massive topic, but it's good to know the history. It's just one line of peacekeeping. And it raises lots of questions, which is what we want. Yeah.